No one saw it coming. The federal courthouse in Manhattan fell completely silent as Janice Combs, Sean Diddy Combs' 83-year-old mother, was escorted to the witness stand. Diddy, who had maintained his composure throughout the trial, visibly stiffened. His attorneys exchanged alarmed glances. The prosecution team sat up straighter. This was the moment that would change everything. If you're new to our channel, please take a moment to like and subscribe for the most comprehensive coverage of high-profile cases like this one. We provide factual, in-depth reporting you won't find elsewhere. Nobody expected Diddy's own mother to testify. The room was already filled with tension during what had been a contentious day of proceedings. Eyes were fixed on the elderly woman as she carefully made her way to the front of the courtroom until she was sworn in. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Even the judge seemed taken aback. No announcement, no warning, just Janice Combs, the woman who had stood by her son through decades of success and controversy, now prepared to speak under oath. Until that moment, Diddy had appeared confident throughout the trial, frequently consulting with his legal team and occasionally smiling at supporters in the gallery. But something had changed. Maybe it was seeing his mother, his most loyal defender, taking the stand as a prosecution witness. Maybe it was the realization that the person who knew him better than anyone was about to speak freely. Maybe it was the dawning recognition that his carefully constructed defense was about to crumble. Whatever it was, Diddy was done pretending. He wasn't sitting there as a celebrity anymore. He was there as a son watching his mother prepare to tell the truth about him. And when Janice Combs began to speak, the courtroom wasn't prepared for what they would hear, because what his mother revealed about their private conversations, her growing concerns over the years, and the truth she could no longer deny, wasn't just devastating to his case. It was a mother's painful reckoning with who her son had truly become. It started like any other day of the trial. The room buzzed with low conversations. The press hunched in their designated rows, and lawyers whispered strategies as they waited for the day's proceedings to begin. But when the prosecutor announced, "The United States calls Janice Combs," the room changed. You could hear a pin drop. Some people thought it was a mistake. Others thought it was a desperate tactic. But the way Janice Combs walked to the stand, her back straight despite her years, her eyes clear and determined, told everyone this was real. The judge raised an eyebrow, and Diddy, who'd been reviewing documents with his attorneys, suddenly looked like he'd been struck. The color drained from his face. His hands, which had been confidently flipping through papers, froze mid-motion. Janice Combs took her seat at the witness stand without making eye contact with anyone. She didn't even glance at her son, who was now staring at her with an expression of disbelief and betrayal. "Mrs. Combs, thank you for being here today," the prosecutor began. "I understand how difficult this must be." Janice Combs nodded slightly, her composure remarkable under the circumstances. The judge allowed it, and from that moment on, the entire trial shifted because what Janice Combs was about to say wasn't part of any media narrative. It wasn't speculative testimony from former employees or business associates. It was the account of the woman who had raised him, who had celebrated his triumphs and defended him against critics for decades. Diddy's attorney immediately objected, arguing that family communications were privileged and that Mrs. Combs' testimony would be prejudicial. The prosecutor countered that no legal privilege protected communications between a mother and adult son, particularly when those communications related to alleged criminal activity. After a brief sidebar, the judge overruled the objection and instructed Mrs. Combs to continue. The courtroom was completely silent. Reporters had stopped typing, their fingers poised over keyboards. Even the court sketch artists had paused, pencils hovering above paper. Diddy's family members in the gallery looked shocked and confused, while the prosecution team maintained carefully neutral expressions. Janice Combs adjusted her glasses and looked directly at the prosecutor. "I've been asked to testify about conversations I've had with my son over the years, and about behaviors I've witnessed that concerned me. I'm here because I believe the truth needs to be told, no matter how painful." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Diddy's lead attorney stood up to object again, but Diddy himself tugged at his sleeve, pulling him back down. It was as if he already knew what was coming and had resigned himself to hearing it. The prosecutor approached with a gentle demeanor, clearly mindful of the witness's age and the emotional difficulty of her position. "Mrs. Combs, could you please tell the court about your relationship with your son?" Janice Combs took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady despite the circumstances. The words that followed would forever change the trajectory of one of the most high-profile criminal trials in recent memory. I raised Sean as a single mother after his father was murdered when he was just a child, Janice Combs began. I worked multiple jobs to provide for him, to give him opportunities I never had. I wanted him to be strong, to be successful, to make something of himself. And he did that. He exceeded every dream I had for him. She described the pride she felt watching her son rise from intern to music executive, from producer to performer, from entrepreneur to billionaire.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Her face softened as she recalled his early days of ambition and determination. Sean was always charismatic, always a leader. Even as a boy, he could convince anyone of anything. He had that gift, she said, a faint smile briefly crossing her face before fading. But somewhere along the way, something changed. She turned slightly toward the jury. Success came so fast, so completely. Suddenly, everyone was saying yes to him. Everyone wanted something from him. Everyone treated him like he was above the rules that applied to ordinary people. And I started to see him believe it. The prosecutor gently guided her through her recollections of the early 2000s when Diddy's career was at its peak. Janice Combs described how she began noticing troubling patterns in her son's behavior, his increasing control over those around him, his explosive anger when challenged, his casual disregard for boundaries. At first, I told myself it was the pressure, she explained. The entertainment industry can be brutal, and he was handling so much. But then I started hearing things, seeing things when I visited his homes. Young women who seemed disoriented. Staff who appeared afraid of him. Rooms I wasn't allowed to enter. She recounted a particular visit to his Miami residence in 2008. I arrived unannounced. Mothers can do that, she said, earning a few nervous chuckles from the gallery. There had been a party the night before. When I walked in, there were staff cleaning up, but they seemed different. Not the normal after-party cleanup. They were collecting phones from various rooms. One young woman was crying while a security guard escorted her out. When Sean saw me, he was furious that I hadn't called ahead. The prosecutor showed Mrs. Combs a photograph. "Do you recognize this location?" She examined it and nodded. "This is the pool house at Sean's Los Angeles home. He converted it into what he called a studio around 2010, but he was very secretive about it. I wasn't allowed inside, which struck me as odd. I had always been welcome everywhere in his homes before that." She described how her concerns grew over the years, how she tried to address them with her son. I raised questions. "Mothers do that too," she said, her voice firmer now. But he would dismiss me, tell me I didn't understand how things worked. In his world, that everything was consensual, that it was just the lifestyle of the music industry. The prosecutor asked about specific conversations. "Did your son ever discuss with you allegations made against him by women?" Janice Combs nodded slowly. "Yes. When the first accusations began surfacing publicly around 2017, I called him immediately. Any mother would. I asked him directly if there was any truth to them. He told me they were lying, that they wanted money, that this happened to all successful men in the industry." She paused, visibly gathering her strength. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. He was my son. "And did something happen to change that belief?" the prosecutor asked gently. "Yes," she replied, her voice becoming quieter. "In late 2023, after Cassie filed her lawsuit, I confronted him again. We were alone in his apartment in New York. I told him I needed to hear the truth, not what his lawyers were telling him to say, not what he was telling the public. Just the truth, between a mother and son." The courtroom was absolutely still as she continued. "He was different that day. Tired, perhaps. The facade cracked a little. He didn't admit everything, but he said something I'll never forget. 'Mom, you don't build what I've built by playing by everyone else's rules. Sometimes people get hurt. That's business.' Her voice broke slightly for the first time. "That's not how I raised him. That's not business. That's not right." Throughout this testimony, Diddy sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His attorneys scribbled notes frantically, occasionally leaning in to whisper to each other. But Diddy himself seemed beyond their reach, lost in the reality of hearing his mother's words. Janice Combs continued, describing how her concerns escalated in early 2024 when the surveillance video of Diddy assaulting Cassie in a hotel hallway was released. I called him immediately after seeing that video. I was devastated. Doesn't begin to describe it. I asked him how he could do such a thing. He told me it was a difficult time in their relationship, that I was only seeing one moment out of context, that he wasn't that person anymore. Did you believe him? The prosecutor asked. No, she replied simply. Not anymore, because I had seen glimpses of that rage myself over the years. Never directed at me, but at staff, at business associates. The Sean in that video wasn't a stranger to me, and that realization broke my heart. As her testimony continued, she described her growing awareness that the allegations against her son formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. She recounted finding disturbing notes in his home office during a visit in early 2024, lists of women's names with notations like handled and potential problem next to them. When I asked him about it, he took the paper from my hands and told me it was business, nothing for me to worry about, she said. But the look in his eyes, I knew. As a mother, you know when your child is hiding something, even when they're grown. The prosecutor approached with another exhibit. Mrs. Combs, I'm showing you what has been marked as Government Exhibit 42. Do you recognize this document? She examined the paper and nodded slowly. Yes. These are notes I began keeping after that conversation. I started writing down things I had witnessed over the years, conversations we'd had, behaviors that concerned me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. And why did you begin keeping these notes? Because I was afraid I was losing perspective, that my love for my son was clouding my judgment. Writing it all down helped me see the pattern more clearly, and what I saw terrified me. At this point, Diddy finally looked up, meeting his mother's eyes for the first time since she had taken the stand. The moment was brief but electric, a silent communication between mother and son that seemed to contain volumes of unspoken pain, betrayal, and perhaps understanding. Janice Combs turned back to the prosecutor, her resolve visibly strengthened. I love my son. That will never change. But I cannot pretend anymore. I cannot be silent anymore. Too many people have been hurt. The prosecutor approached with careful consideration of the witness's emotional state. Mrs. Combs, I want to ask you about a specific conversation you had with your son in April of this year, after his arrest, but before this trial began. Can you tell the court about that conversation? Janice Combs straightened in her seat, as if preparing herself for the most difficult part of her testimony. Yes, I visited Sean at the detention center. It was just the two of us in a private room. They made special arrangements because of who he is, she continued. I told him that I needed to hear the truth, all of it, before I could continue supporting him publicly. I said, Sean, I'm your mother. I love you unconditionally, but I need to know what I'm standing behind. The courtroom was utterly silent as she recounted his response. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, The truth? The truth is, I created a world where I made the rules, where what I wanted happened, where people either played along or got pushed aside. Was it always right? No. Did people get hurt? Yes. But that's how power works, Ma. That's how it's always worked. She paused, taking a moment to compose herself. I asked him about the specific allegations, the parties, the recordings, the drugs, the threats. I needed to hear him deny it if it wasn't true. And did he deny it? The prosecutor asked. No, she replied simply. He said, It's complicated. Everything was consensual at the beginning. Nobody was forced. But once you're in that world, the lines get blurred. Sometimes people change their minds later. But by then, they'd already taken the money, the opportunities. They'd already benefited. Janice Combs's hands trembled slightly as she continued. I told him that consent obtained through pressure, through fear of consequences, through intoxication. That isn't real consent. He just looked at me and said, That's not how it works in my world. At the defense table, Diddy's attorneys appeared increasingly alarmed. His lead counsel wrote a note and pushed it toward him. But Diddy ignored it, his eyes now fixed on his mother. The prosecutor gently pressed, "Did your son ever explicitly admit to the criminal conduct he's charged with?" "Not in those words," Janice Combs replied, "but he told me enough for me to understand the truth. He said, 'The system I built worked for years. Everyone got what they wanted. It only became a problem when people decided to change the rules.'" She looked directly at the jury. "I raised my son to take responsibility for his actions, to be accountable. When he told me that, I knew he had lost his way. He wasn't seeing people as people anymore, just as pieces in a game he believed he controlled." The prosecutor introduced another exhibit, a letter written by Janice Combs to her son after that visit. In it, she expressed her unconditional love, but also her profound disappointment and her unwillingness to continue defending behavior she now understood to be destructive and wrong. "Did you receive a response to this letter?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," she replied. "Sean called me. He was angry at first, then almost pleading. He said I didn't understand what was at stake, that his whole life, everything he'd built was on the line. I told him that was precisely why I had to speak the truth, because lives were at stake, just not only his." The prosecutor then asked about her decision to testify. "Mrs. Combs, what brought you here today? Why did you agree to testify in this case?" Janice Combs took a deep breath. "Because the truth matters. Because accountability matters. Because I raised my son to be better than this. And because I believe that true love, a mother's love, means wanting your child to face the consequences of their actions so they can become better, not protecting them from those consequences and watching them become worse." She looked at her son again, longer this time. "I'm here because I love my son enough to tell the truth about him, even when that truth is painful. I'm here because the women who were hurt deserve someone to stand up and acknowledge their pain. And I'm here because Sean needs to understand that no amount of money, fame, or power places you above basic human decency." As she spoke these words, something in Diddy's composure finally broke. His shoulders sagged. His carefully maintained expression of confidence crumbled. For the first time since the trial began, he looked not like a powerful music mogul, but like a son facing his mother's disappointment. Perhaps the one judgment he had never prepared himself to face. The prosecutor thanked Mrs. Combs and returned to her seat. The defense attorney stood for cross-examination, but his approach was notably gentle, almost respectful. He didn't attempt to discredit her or suggest ulterior motives, focusing instead on establishing that she hadn't directly witnessed any criminal acts and that her testimony was based on conversations and impressions rather than first-hand observation of alleged crimes. Throughout the cross-examination, Janice Combs remained composed, acknowledging the limitations of her testimony while standing firmly by its central truth, that her son had created and operated a system that exploited and harmed others, and that he had essentially admitted this to her in private conversations. As she was finally excused from the witness stand, she paused, looking directly at her son once more. No words were exchanged, but the look contained decades of love, disappointment, and a mother's enduring hope for redemption. Then she walked slowly past the defense table and out of the courtroom, her back straight, her dignity intact. Diddy watched her go, and something in his expression suggested that of all the testimony the jury had heard over the weeks of trial, his mother's words had affected him most profoundly. The masks had fallen away, leaving only the truth between a mother and her son. Following Janice Combs's testimony, the prosecution called Dr. Margaret Chen, an expert in family psychology specializing in cases involving powerful public figures. After establishing her credentials, the prosecutor asked her to explain the significance of what the court had just heard. "What we witnessed today was extraordinary," Dr. Chen explained. "In high-profile cases involving wealthy or famous defendants, we often see family members either remaining silent or providing unwavering support, regardless of the evidence. For a mother to testify as Mrs. Combs did represents a profound break from that pattern," she continued. "From a psychological perspective, this suggests that Mrs. Combs reached what we call a moral tipping point, a moment when the cognitive dissonance between loving her son and recognizing the harm he has caused became too great to sustain. The fact that she described a gradual awakening rather than a sudden realization lends significant credibility to her testimony." The prosecutor asked about the specific dynamics Janice Combs had described. The pattern of her son dismissing her concerns, invoking business as justification, and suggesting that normal rules didn't apply to him. These are classic manifestations of what we call power insulation, Dr. Chen explained. Individuals with extreme wealth, fame, and influence often become surrounded by people who reinforce their sense of exceptionalism and shield them from consequences. A mother is often the last person who can penetrate that insulation because she knew the individual before the power, before the wealth. She elaborated on how Diddy's reported statements to his mother revealed a worldview shaped by decades of having his behavior normalized, excused, or concealed by those around him. When Mr. Combs allegedly told his mother, "That's how power works," he was expressing a belief system that had likely been reinforced countless times throughout his career. The prosecutor displayed excerpts from Janice Combs's notes on the courtroom screens. Dr. Chen, what do you make of the evolution in Mrs. Combs's observations over time? After reviewing the notes, which spanned from 2008 to 2024, Dr. Chen pointed out how the mother's initial benefit of the doubt interpretations gradually gave way to more concerned observations, culminating in explicit documentation of troubling patterns. What's notable here is the consistency of the behaviors Mrs. Combs recorded, even as her interpretation of those behaviors evolved, Dr. Chen observed. Early entries show her attributing concerning incidents to stress, industry pressure, or isolated bad judgment. Later entries show her recognizing the same behaviors as part of a pattern of control and exploitation. As Dr. Chen continued her testimony, she placed Janice Combs's observations in the context of the broader allegations against Diddy, explaining how a mother's perspective offered unique insight into the authentic character of an individual who had spent decades crafting a carefully managed public image. In my professional experience, she stated, when family members who have loyally supported a defendant reach a point where they can no longer reconcile their love with the evidence before them, it often represents a critical turning point in both legal proceedings and the defendant's own self-perception. Throughout this expert testimony, Diddy remained withdrawn, occasionally whispering to his attorneys but primarily staring at the table before him. The confident demeanor that had characterized his courthouse appearances had vanished, replaced by what observers described as a combination of resignation and profound distress. The defense's cross-examination of Dr. Chen focused on the generalities of her analysis rather than the specifics of Janice Combs's testimony, suggesting she was offering speculative interpretations without direct knowledge of the family dynamics. Dr. Chen acknowledged the limitations of her analysis, but maintained that the patterns described were consistent with well-established psychological principles regarding power, accountability, and family systems. As this portion of testimony concluded, the impact of Janice Combs's words continued to reverberate through the courtroom. Jurors who had previously appeared stoic or neutral during even the most disturbing testimony now showed visible emotional reactions, several wiping away tears, others taking extensive notes, all seemingly processing the weight of a mother's testimony against her own son. When court reconvened after a brief recess, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Sources close to the defense team reported that Diddy had been nearly unreachable during the break, refusing to engage with his attorney's attempts to discuss strategy. The prosecution team, meanwhile, appeared to be recalibrating their approach. In light of the morning's powerful testimony, Judge Arun Subramanian addressed both legal teams. In light of this morning's developments, does either side wish to make any motions or requests before we continue? Diddy's lead attorney stood. Your Honor, the defense requests a brief continuance to confer with our client and reassess our position. The request was unusual at this stage of a trial that had already stretched for weeks. The prosecutor objected, arguing that a delay would disrupt the jury's focus and potentially prejudice the government's case. After consideration, the judge granted a limited continuance until the following morning, instructing the jury to return at 9 a.m. As court adjourned for the day, reporters rushed to file stories with headlines like "Mother's Testimony Shakes," "Diddy Trial," and "Janice Combs Breaks Silence Against Son." Legal analysts on every network debated the impact of the testimony, with most concluding that it represented a potentially insurmountable blow to the defense. When proceedings resumed the next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded, with spectators lining up before dawn hoping for a seat. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as the judge took the bench and the jury was seated. Before testimony could resume, Diddy's attorney stood. Your Honor, after extensive consultation with our client, we request the opportunity for Mr. Combs to address the court. The request sent murmurs through the gallery. The prosecutor objected immediately, arguing that any statement from the defendant should come through proper testimony under oath and subject to cross-examination. After hearing arguments from both sides, the judge made his ruling. Mr. Combs, if you wish to make a statement to this court, you must do so from the witness stand, under oath, and subject to cross-examination by the prosecution. Do you understand and agree to these conditions? All eyes turned to Diddy, who stood slowly. Yes, Your Honor. I understand and agree. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Until this moment, legal experts had widely assumed Diddy would not testify, following the standard strategy in criminal cases where defendants risk creating additional vulnerability through their testimony. His decision to take the stand signaled either a dramatic shift in strategy or a personal choice that overrode his attorney's advice. After being sworn in, Diddy took the witness stand. Gone was the designer suit and confident demeanor that had characterized his court appearances. Instead, he wore a simple dark suit, his posture subdued, his expression somber. His attorney began with a simple question. Mr. Combs, why have you chosen to testify today? Diddy looked up, his eyes moving briefly across the crowded courtroom before settling on the jury. I listened to my mother yesterday. Really listened. And I realized I've been hiding from the truth for so long that I'd almost convinced myself of the lies. His voice was quieter than anyone had heard it before, lacking the charismatic force that had helped build his empire. My mother raised me better than what I became. She taught me about respect, about integrity, about treating people right. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of those lessons. His attorney seemed momentarily thrown by this opening, but recovered. Can you tell the jury about your understanding of the charges against you? I understand that I'm charged with serious crimes, Diddy replied. Racketeering, sex trafficking, coercion. For years, I told myself that what I was doing was just business, just the way the industry works. I told myself that everyone benefited, everyone consented, everyone knew what they were getting into. He paused, taking a deep breath. But that wasn't true. I created an environment where people couldn't freely say no, where the threat of consequences, career destruction, public humiliation, financial ruin, hung over every interaction. I didn't call it coercion, I called it leverage. But it was wrong. As Diddy continued his testimony, he described how success, wealth, and power had gradually corrupted his perspective. He spoke about creating a world where his desires were paramount, where staff and associates understood that their job was to facilitate and then cover up whatever he wanted. He acknowledged creating a system of NDAs, payoffs, and threats that kept victims silent for years. I convinced myself that if people took the money, accepted the opportunities, signed the agreements, then everything was consensual. I ignored the power differential that made true consent impossible in many of those situations. When asked about specific allegations from victims who had testified earlier in the trial, Diddy largely confirmed their accounts, occasionally adding that his memory of certain events was compromised by his own substance use at the time. His attorney, clearly navigating unfamiliar territory with a client who was not following the expected defense strategy, asked about Janice Combs's testimony. Your mother described conversations where you essentially admitted to creating a system that exploited others. Was her recollection accurate? Diddy nodded slowly. Yes. My mother has never lied to me or about me. She told the truth yesterday. When she visited me after my arrest, I did tell her those things. I was still justifying my behavior then, still telling myself that power simply operated by different rules. I couldn't see, or didn't want to see, how wrong that was. As direct examination concluded, the prosecutor approached for cross-examination. Her approach was direct but measured, recognizing that Diddy's apparent confession required careful handling. Mr. Combs, you've described creating a system where consent was compromised by power differentials, threats, and coercion. Are you aware that what you're describing aligns with the legal definitions of the crimes you're charged with? Yes, Diddy replied. I've had a lot of time to think since my arrest, a lot of time to learn about these laws and understand how they apply to my actions. And yet you initially pled not guilty to all charges. What changed? Diddy looked toward the gallery where his mother had been sitting the day before. though her seat was now empty. Yesterday happened. Hearing my mother speak the truth that I've been denying for so long, it broke something open in me. The last defense I had was telling myself that the people who really knew me, who loved me, they understood I wasn't the monster the prosecution was describing. Hearing my mother's testimony took that away. The prosecutor's questioning became more specific, walking Diddy through the elements of each criminal charge and effectively extracting admissions that aligned with the legal definitions of sex trafficking, racketeering, and the other counts he faced. By the time cross-examination concluded, Diddy appeared exhausted and defeated. His testimony, rather than offering a defense, had effectively corroborated the prosecution's case in many respects. As he stepped down from the witness stand, he paused, looking out at the courtroom filled with reporters, victims, curious spectators, and his own family members. For a moment, it seemed he might make an additional statement, but instead, he simply returned to the defense table in silence. The judge called for a brief recess before the next witness. As the courtroom began to clear, Diddy remained seated, staring straight ahead, the weight of his own testimony visibly pressing down on him. The man who had once built an empire on confidence and charisma had just dismantled it with his own words. Following the recess, in a move that stunned the courtroom, Diddy's attorneys requested a meeting with the prosecution and the judge in chambers. When they emerged 30 minutes later, the judge addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have been informed that the defendant wishes to change his plea. Before we proceed, I want to ensure that this decision is being made knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily." The judge then conducted a thorough colloquy with Diddy, ensuring he understood the rights he was waiving and the potential sentences he faced. When asked if anyone had coerced him into changing his plea, Diddy shook his head. "No, Your Honor, this is my decision. After hearing my mother's testimony and reflecting on the truth of my actions, I cannot, in good conscience, continue to deny responsibility." The judge accepted the change of plea, scheduling sentencing for 6 weeks later. As the proceedings concluded, victims who had testified during the trial watched in silence, some holding hands, others wiping away tears. The case that many had expected to continue for weeks had reached an unexpected resolution in the wake of a mother's testimony and a son's belated acknowledgement of the truth. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for reactions. Janice Combs, who had returned to witness her son's change of plea, made a brief statement. "Today is a difficult day, but also a necessary one. I love my son unconditionally. That will never change. But love without truth isn't really love at all. I hope this is the beginning of healing for Sean, for those he harmed, and for our family." As Diddy was led from the courtroom in custody, his final public appearance before sentencing, he looked nothing like the music mogul who had built a billion-dollar empire. He looked like what he had finally admitted to being, a man who had abused his power and was now facing the consequences. When Sean "Diddy" Combs changed his plea to guilty, he didn't look like someone who had lost a legal battle. He looked like someone who had finally found a kind of peace in the truth. The courtroom remained quiet, processing the unexpected turn of events. Even the judge seemed momentarily at a loss for words, before recovering his professional demeanor to handle the technical aspects of accepting the plea. Some of the jurors, released from their duty without having to deliberate, had tears in their eyes. And Diddy, for the first time since his arrest, looked unburdened, not of responsibility, but of the weight of denial he had carried for so long. Diddy didn't speak to the press following the proceedings. He was immediately taken into custody, where he would remain until sentencing. His legal team issued a brief statement. "Mr. Combs has accepted responsibility for his actions. He asks for privacy for his family during this difficult time and expresses deep remorse to those he has harmed." But outside the courtroom, the world was only beginning to react. The music industry, which had initially responded to Diddy's arrest with cautious statements about letting the legal process unfold, now faced the reality of his admission. Record labels issued statements condemning abuse of power and announcing reviews of internal policies. Artists who had collaborated with him distanced themselves, some expressing shock, others admitting they had heard rumors for years but hadn't known what to believe. Behind closed doors, entertainment companies convened. Emergency meetings. Contracts were reviewed, projects canceled, associations severed. And while many tried to frame Diddy's behavior as that of a lone bad actor, the internet was already connecting dots that suggested a more systemic problem. Old interviews resurfaced, showing industry insiders alluding to how things work, in language eerily similar to what Diddy had described in his testimony. Photos and videos from industry events were re-examined with new context, and most significantly, other victims from across the entertainment world began coming forward with their own stories of abuse and exploitation. Fans weren't just shocked, they were engaged in painful self-examination. Many expressed guilt for having supported Diddy's career despite years of rumors and allegations. Others questioned why it had taken a mother's testimony to finally break through the wall of protection that wealth and fame had built. The era of unquestioning celebrity worship showed signs of cracking. At the sentencing hearing 6 weeks later, Janice Combs was present, seated in the front row. She watched as several victims delivered powerful impact statements, describing how Diddy's actions had damaged their careers, their trust, and their sense of self-worth. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Diddy addressed the court. "I want to apologize to everyone I've hurt through my actions, to the women who trusted me and whose trust I betrayed, to the colleagues and employees I implicated in my behavior, to my children, who now have to live with the legacy of their father's mistakes, and to my mother, who taught me better than how I chose to live." He continued, his voice steady but humbled. "I can't undo the harm I've caused. I can only acknowledge it, accept the